We're sitting today in the last building my father completed. He didn't get to complete it the way he designed it. The building committee insisted on radial aisles, that is to say, aisles down the center. My father was a great believer in concert halls and churches in continental seating, which exits are out the sides. My father was christened William Wesley Peters. He spent his early childhood in Evansville, Indiana. He went to MIT, where he was enrolled in the architecture program and took a lot of math classes. And on a casual afternoon, he went to Madison, Wisconsin, where his sister was going to be instated in her freshman year. Her parents drove them both up there. And so my father, of course, was going to go out to Spring Green and see what he could see of this guy, Frank Lloyd Wright. They evidently hit it off right away. And my father had no intention of enrolling in another school that day, he said. He was all set to go back to MIT for his third year. And he said it was just out the door like that. I knew I was at the place that I should be. He said, "Where do I sign?" sort of like. And when he heard what the tuition was, he whipped out his checkbook and paid the tuition right on the spot. And my grandfather said what I consider a typical remark. He said, "You're the first apprentice." And my father looked at him and said, "But Mr. Wright, there's several people around who are also apprentices." "Yeah," my grandfather said, "but you're the first to pay, so you're the first." So he left then, went back to Madison, all that stuff, packed his bags, not for Boston, but for little Spring Green, Wisconsin. He was just a powerhouse. He was a great organizer. He would organize crews, he would organize God knows what, design teams or whatever he needed to get the job done. My father was learning so fast. He worked day and night, and it never bothered him. He could stay awake all night working on something and be just as bright in the morning as I am right now. He was a complete architect, and I mean architect in the old sense, where the architect did the preliminary drawings for the client. If the client liked those preliminaries, then he engaged the architect to do the working drawings, and the architect remained a supervisor of the building right through to the finish. But he could plumb wire, he could do the whole thing. He was good at any aspect of getting a building built. He became my grandfather's right-hand man. He could solve any problem that came up, or if he couldn't solve it, they'd have to redesign it. He was pretty much an indispensable part during the late 30s and early 40s. And he was, at that time, paying the bills for Taliesin. If it hadn't been for my father, I don't think there would have been a Taliesin, because there weren't a whole lot of people in the 30s who were thinking about, well, why don't we go out and see this nutty architect out in the countryside in Wisconsin? You know, why don't we just go to one that's right downtown here in Oak Park or wherever? So he didn't have much work. My father also bought Taliesin, Midway, and Hillside, which is to say the Wisconsin complex, back from the sheriff. There's no telling how things would have gone if my mother had not been killed, but killed she was. And my father took approximately There's no way to put a time limit on that, but it wasn't 4 or 5 years before he began to really get himself together. He was a workaholic, and he just threw himself into his work. Everything had to be done right now, working full speed ahead. And if the other people couldn't do it, by God, he was going to do it. And he really took on the work of several people from time to time until they could get people to take care of it. And years later, the Guggenheim Museum was under construction. I noticed right away that the plywood, you can see the plywood in the forms. You can't see the plywood anymore, but you can see where it was in the forms all the way up the spiral. And I said, Papa, how did that happen? Because that never would have been allowed at Taliesin, and they weren't professionals at all. And he said, Brandock, your grandfather and I talked that over, and we could have made the contractor redo that, but we knew it would ruin him if we did that. So we decided to let it pass. But the second story was to show you how good my old man was at doing what he did. The forms were being taken off of the core that holds the whole spiral up, and he didn't have to see it. I mean, it was quitting time, and he was ready to go to a supper with lots of people, just people involved in the building. Went downtown, down to the village, and Bill Short was the supervisor on site, and he said, Wes, I'll join you. I'd just like to do a few things here. And so my father said he sat down and had ordered dinner, and in came Bill Short, panting, out of breath, red-faced, and said, Wes, they just took the forms off the core, and there's a 14-inch crack in the bottom. And my father said the whole world fell out from under him. He said, I just couldn't imagine such a thing. And I kept, even as I was running out the door, I was thinking, what could I have done that would lead to something like that? How could this have happened? And he offered the cab driver $20 on top of the meter, which at that time was a hell of a boost. And the driver took him up the museum, and he poured out of several people had come with him. He didn't even see him. He said, didn't know that they were even there. I headed for the core as fast as I could go. And sure enough, there was this big crack. And I fell on my knees and was sitting there thinking, how could that have happened? What should we do about it? Oh my God, how serious is it? And a little digression. At that time, my grandfather had hired a famous Spanish engineer named Toroya. And to say the least, he was a highly respected man. And he came up on the packed crowd around the crack and pushed his way through and looked down at this crack. And then he turned to my father and said, you call that a crack? Come to Spain, I'll show you cracks. My father felt as though the whole world had come back together again. And they didn't repair it. There was no real value to repairing. They filled it in, and it's there. It's been there for years and years. The point of this whole story has been my father never made a mistake, anything like that. That was the biggest mistake I've heard about his making. He was a brilliant engineer, and he was a brilliant practical engineer. He wasn't just a theoretician. I mean, he found the theory because it would solve the problem at hand. A week before his death, a professor, curiously enough, from MIT came to the archives at Taliesin West. So they asked him which drawings he'd like to look at. And he said, I don't want to see the drawings. I want to see the calculations. And having spent about 3 hours, the man looked up and said, "Do you realize what you have here? This is pure poetry, pure mathematical poetry." And he said, "For instance, there's an algorithm that we at MIT have long known was there, quote, there, but we didn't know what it was. And so we used grad students over the years, and we looked for it for about 20 years. And we found it 2 years ago, using all the computing power, the modern computing power available to MIT. But this guy found it in 1934 using a slide rule. That was one of the formulas, or rather algorithms, he used in the sunshade at Falling Water, the one from the guest house to the main house. He simply, I think, wanted to see the buildings that were drawn come to life as actual buildings. I think it was just a consuming passion of his. After my grandfather's death, he was responsible for finishing Grady Gamage Hall in Tempe. And I had just arrived from Juilliard for the Easter vacation. And so he and some other people took me to dinner in Scottsdale, and my father was still consumed by the building in Tempe, and he started talking about it. It would have been impossible for him not to have dinner without talking about it. And he said, I wish I could hear how it sounds. It doesn't have any seats in it, but I want to hear the sound. I said, sort of jokingly, well, if you want to, I'll go over there and I'll play something, and that should give you an idea. He said, really? He said, I have the key. So he goes over to this black building, and he knows right where all the light switches are, and I play something. I forget what I play, but I do remember the impression I had was it was as though one were playing in a small room. There was no trouble with the sound and the marvelous design. I'm sorry to be admiring of that particular hall, because it was designed by my grandfather and completed by my father. My father got a commission to build a palace for the sister of the Shah of Iran. And she made it known that she wanted a modern building, but one that fully expressed the traditions of Iran. And my father was really taken by some of the buildings there. So as usual, he went out and bought every book that he could find on the subject, read through them, and he was a self-trained speed reader, and he remembered everything that he read. It was really hard on a kid that was growing up with him doing this. I brought a book in for him to read, written by the historian Harold Lamb, that I had thought was really remarkable. And it sat on his night table for 10 days, and I finally had to take the book back to the high school library. So I said, I'll be in here at 8 o'clock to pick up the book. And when I came in, he said, this was at 6:30, I told him that. He said, I've read it now, and I really enjoyed it. I said, what do you mean you've read it? You couldn't possibly have read it in that time. He said, well, ask me a question. Ask me several questions. And I did, and he knew the answer to every one of them. I couldn't understand how he could have done that. And he did that with the princess's palace, and designed what I think is a really remarkable building called the Pearl Palace. And he got the drawings all drawn up and agreed to meet Nizam, who was the contact, and the princess in Switzerland. So they set the drawings up and had a cover over them, and the princess came in and sat down, and my father went up and took the cover off And the princess got up and walked out of the room immediately, quickly, and her husband followed her out. And not a word was said. And my father looked at Nizam and said, "My God, what's happened? Did we do something wrong? Is this good or is this bad?" And Nizam said, "I don't know, it looks pretty bad to me." So they sat there quietly, and 20 minutes passed, and she came back. She was overcome by the beauty of the design, and she said, "Excuse me, I'm very sorry. The building is so perfect. I couldn't have imagined that it would have fit what I wanted the way this building does."